This section is geared towards reviewing the nutritional composition of foods and what carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are. Nutrition is a complicated concept, and this will touch on everything nutrition in just a few slides. So we are pretty much just scratching the surface. If you would like to know more about any one nutrition concept, please email me and I will do my best to provide you with some guidance. This chapter is largely focused on fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. Know their functions, healthy sources, and the basic units of each of these nutrients. Also, be able to identify the difference between a solution and a dispersion. There's a lot of information in this chapter, but have a strong grasp on the major concepts in order to do well on the exam. Our foods are made up of millions of individual chemicals. We are really simplifying things by only looking at these 6 classifications, but these are the main groups of nutrients that our body needs. The first group is comprised of the macronutrients, or nutrients that we need in very large quantities. This includes carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. The figure on the right shows each of their main purposes and functions. We will go into detail on these topics in later slides in this chapter, but this visual provides a very simple image for you to use to understand the chemical makeup and functions of carbohydrates, proteins, and fat. The micronutrients, which we will not discuss and which you do not need to know for this class, include vitamins and minerals. They are given the prefix micro because we need a much lower quantity of these nutrients than the macros. However, they still perform essential functions, and our body will not function optimally if it does not receive a sufficient amount of any single vitamin or mineral. There is a great deal of research behind all of the vitamins and minerals, and they are all related to assisting in bodily functions. Minerals also contribute to the body structure. Water is the third group, and although it is needed in very large quantities like the macronutrients, we place it in its own category due to its unique nature. We will not go into great detail with water for this chapter, but do understand these 2 main concepts. Water is found in almost all foods to some degree, even if they are very dry foods. We will talk more about this in the next slide. Water is a liquid, but water hardness refers to the presence of molecules other than water. This could include iron, calcium, magnesium, or any other non-water molecules. Hard waters can make tougher doughs and are also not as effective at softening foods. It is obvious that soups, watermelon, and many other fruits and vegetables contain water. But this slide and this visual helps to show you that almost all foods have water in them to some degree, even some of the drier foods. The only foods that do not contain any water are pure fats, sugar, and salt. Carbohydrates are the first of the 3 energy-producing compounds that we will look at. Energy-producing indicates that there are calories that are provided by this nutrient. This is true for carbohydrates, proteins, and fat. Carbohydrates are primarily broken into 2 different classifications, and these are starches and sugars. Sugar is the most basic unit. Starch is simply a group of sugar molecules linked together. Again, the main 2 groups of carbohydrates are sugar and starch. Sugar is simple. It's just 1 or 2 molecules, while starch is complex. It's comprised of 10 or more sugar molecules. Sugar is 1 or 2, starch is many. Fiber is the third group of carbohydrates. Our body does not do a good job of digesting fiber, which is actually a really good thing, because fiber helps to push any blockage through our digestive system to help prevent any items from lingering too long, which can cause constipation or other problems related to the large intestine, such as diverticulosis or even cancer. The main function of carbohydrates is to provide the body with energy. How many of your friends or family were a part of the Atkins craze or the low-carb trend of the early 2000s? How many of them were either always low on energy or were constantly denying that they did not have much energy? Probably most of them. You can get energy from other food sources, but carbohydrates provide energy for daily activities that are more intense. Fiber is an example of a carbohydrate. It has a few different roles that we could go into detail about, but the main function of fiber is to help with digestion. Also, if we do not eat enough carbohydrates, our body will use its own protein. Since protein is a component of our muscle tissue, we will actually break down and lose muscle tissue in order to supply our body with energy if we do not get enough total carbohydrate. From a health standpoint, you may have heard that simple carbs are bad, while complex carbs are good. This is simply not true. There are healthy simple carbohydrates and there are unhealthy complex carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates are sugars, like candies and sodas, but they also include fruits and vegetables. Complex carbohydrates are starches, such as quinoa and sweet potatoes, but they are also white bread and white pasta. With low-carb fads, such as the Atkins diet, carbohydrates have gotten a bad rap over the past 15 or so years. It's important to understand that carbohydrates play essential roles in our body, but we only get the health benefits from carbohydrates if we get the right sources. A big problem with carbohydrate foods is that there are so many unhealthy carbohydrates in our food supply. The processed sugars and refined grains are primarily carbohydrates and are directly related to weight gain and inflammation. If you go to the grocery store and count the foods that are mostly carbohydrates, first of all, you will have a very busy day. You will probably end up with a list of thousands of foods. However, you will also find that a good majority of the carbohydrate foods available to us are highly processed. Whole grain carbohydrates in fruits are excellent sources of carbohydrates because they also provide the body with many other nutrients and dietary fiber. On top of all this, and one more fun fact to consider, whole grain bread, whole grain pasta, whole grain cereals are considered better carbohydrate sources. However, many of these contain gluten, which many people have sensitivities to, which over a long period of time can lead to inflammation and other health problems. There's a good chance that this may cause some confusion. But for your exam, just be able to identify the simple differences between carbohydrates that are good and carbohydrates that are bad. Good carbohydrates are pretty much the unprocessed carbohydrates and have more nutrients. Bad carbohydrates are very processed and tend to be composed of refined grains and refined sugars. If you would ever like to know any more about gluten or what comprises a healthy carbohydrate, please send me an email and I will get back to you right away on this. For this class, triglyceride is going to be the simplest and most common form of fat. There are two different forms of fats. These are saturated and unsaturated. Regardless of what you may have heard, saturated and unsaturated do not mean healthy and unhealthy. There are healthy forms of each of these foods. There are unhealthy forms of each of these foods. Largely this is related to whether or not they are processed, just like the carbohydrates. The main functions of fat are to provide the body with energy, help to absorb vitamins, and protect our internal organs. The energy that fats provide is a bit different than carbohydrates. This energy helps with slower paced body functions. When we're walking or just sitting around, our body is relying primarily on fat for energy. There are certain water-soluble and fat-soluble vitamins. The fat-soluble vitamins require a sufficient amount of dietary fat and body fat in order to be absorbed and used. Without adequate fat, these vitamins will simply run right through our body. And finally, fat surrounds our organs. Too much fat around our organs can cause complications, but the right amount will keep our organs warm and safe. Fat also protects our bones and prevents them from being broken. When we talk about fats in this chapter and in the lab, you will hear the terms oils and fats. Both of these are fats, and one is not necessarily healthier than the other. The difference between the two is simply related to their forms at room temperature. At room temperature, fats are solid and oils are liquid. Now let's look at butter. If you heat butter, it will turn soft and eventually into a liquid form, but this is not at room temperature. Looking at olive oil, have you ever let olive oil stay out at colder temperatures? What happens when you do this? It will change composition and turn a bit lumpy. This is just the oil solidifying, which will happen to butter just at a different temperature. But because oil is liquid at a room temperature, because olive oil is liquid at a room temperature, it's considered an oil. Fats contain more calories per gram than carbohydrates. They were also previously linked to cardiovascular disease. Now, do either of these connections make them unhealthy foods? The answer is a resounding no. As we learn more about fat, we understand that it has many important roles in our body. Problems with dietary fat are related to their sources, just like carbohydrates. Fats that are more processed are linked to health problems, while fats that are unprocessed are linked to many health benefits. For example, let us take a look at meat. High-fat meats used to be linked strongly to heart disease and cancer. However, researchers have looked further into this and found that organic, naturally raised meats pose virtually no health problems, even if they are high in fat. Processed meats, such as hot dogs and lunch meats, contain nitrates, other preservatives, and chemicals that are the real culprits behind inflammation, heart disease, and cancer. So the problems with fats are commonly associated or commonly linked to processed meats. So what is the bottom line? There really should be no restrictions of dietary fat. These foods play many important roles in our body, even helping us store weight appropriately. Just make sure that you get the right sources. More to come shortly on this. Going back to heart disease or coronary artery disease, there was a previous link between dietary fat intake and coronary or heart disease. This is largely a misconception based on research that did not examine the whole health picture of fats. Heart disease is largely related to plaque that builds up in our arteries. This slows or even stops blood flow in the case of a heart attack. The omega-3s that we can only receive from fats have anti-inflammatory properties which will help to pick away at any plaque that is built up in our arteries. So processed fats may be related to coronary artery disease, but unprocessed natural fats contain the omega-3s that will help create a healthy blood flow and help to reduce any plaque that is built up in our arteries. Once again, the link between health and fat is more than just unsaturated versus saturated. Healthy fat foods can come from both of these sources. Know that healthy fats are linked to unprocessed fats, such as nuts, seeds, avocados, olive oil, coconut oil, natural peanut and nut butters, and even butter. We will discuss the role of fat in baking in greater detail in later chapters. However, this slide will take a look at some of the main functions of fat in cooking. Fat is an excellent medium for heat transfer because you can heat fat to very high temperatures, and it does a good job of distributing the heat to foods. It also helps to prevent foods from sticking to the pans. Fat increases tenderness and juiciness of foods while also boosting its flavor. Consider a low-fat cookie. It is very difficult to create the same taste as a higher-fat, full-fat cookie, and there is a good chance that even if the low-fat cookie is tender, there is going to be some compromise that occurs with its taste and texture. It is very different from the high-fat cookie that contains plenty of butter or oil. And finally, fats act as emulsifiers. They help to hold together certain food compounds that do normally not mix well. The final energy-yielding nutrient that we will discuss in this chapter is protein. Proteins in our food and in our body are comprised of a complex connection of different amino acids, the simplest protein unit. The main functions of protein are broken down into two different classifications. Number 1, enzyme function, and number 2, contribute to muscle and tissue structure. Enzymes are forms of protein that help chemical reactions occur in our body in order to ensure that our body functions optimally. Proteins also contribute to muscle tissue. Bodybuilders place a very strong emphasis on protein because of this. When we are low on protein, our muscles deteriorate. We also need sufficient carbohydrates and fats to promote muscle structure, but this is the main function and main association of protein. Protein comes from both vegetarian and meat-based sources. You can get plenty of protein from vegetarian foods, but it is more of a challenge to do so because vegetarian proteins contain less total protein per serving than meat and animal-based proteins. Have you ever heard of the incomplete versus complete protein concept? This is all related to essential amino acids. Essential amino acids are what our bodies require from foods because our body, technically, does not produce them. Meats and meat products contain nearly all of the essential amino acids, and therefore nutrition experts used to tell us that these were the best sources of protein. You could get all the essential amino acids from vegetarian proteins, but the previous research said that you had to appropriately and very carefully complement them and eat them with one another. This is not true anymore. Eat enough total protein, even if it is just from vegetarian sources, and your body will convert whatever amino acids it does have into the amino acids that it is lacking. So ultimately, incomplete proteins are not so incomplete after all. Research today tells us that the body can convert amino acids that we consume plenty of into amino acids that we are lacking. So as long as we get enough protein, regardless of the source, regardless of whether or not it is 100% vegetarian proteins, our bodies will do the necessary work to create the amino acids that we are lacking. Here is a quick look at a simple concept related to cooking proteins, and this is specifically related to cooking sugars and proteins together. This is known as the Maillard reaction. This causes the browning of sugar and creation of a final optimal flavor. Let's take a marshmallow for example. When you roast a marshmallow correctly, which is easier said than done, it turns a light brown and has a different taste than a non-cooked marshmallow. This marshmallow product is a perfect example of the Maillard reaction. The final concept that we will look at during this chapter is related to solutions and dispersions. This picture is not a perfect example of a solution versus a dispersion, but it will still help to paint a picture of this difference. The picture on the right is a solution, while the picture on the left is more of a dispersion. A solution occurs when a solute is completely dissolved in a substance. Notice on the right that you cannot see any small particles in the liquid. This is because it has been completely absorbed by the liquid. There is just one substance there, there's not two. On the left, which is not a true dispersion, there is no final solution. You can tell that the two ingredients have not mixed, and that's the characteristics of a dispersion. A really good example of a dispersion is oil and water, because those two will never mix.